Clara's breath caught in her throat as she watched Vivian's trembling hand slip a USB drive into her purse, the very same drive that contained client files worth millions files, that could destroy every powerful man who'd ever hired their services. The soft click of the study door echoed through the marble hallway of the Meridian Agency's headquarters, and Clara pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized her mentor, the woman who'd taught her every rule about remaining untouchable, had just broken the most sacred one of all. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Clara's penthouse apartment, casting long shadows across the pristine white walls that had never known the warmth of personal photographs or sentimental clutter. She stood before her walk-in closet, selecting today's Armora midnight blue dress that hugged her curves, while maintaining an air of untouchable elegance. Every piece in her wardrobe was carefully chosen, each outfit a calculated decision, designed to attract attention while maintaining distance. Clara Martinez had built her reputation on being unreachable. In the 3 years since joining Meridian Elite Companions, she'd mastered the art of being everything, and nothing to her clients beautiful enough to inspire desire, intelligent enough to hold conversations with world leaders, and cold enough to ensure no one ever mistook her for anything more than what she was, a perfectly crafted illusion. The rules were simple, burned into her memory from day one. No touching beyond what was absolutely necessary for appearances. No personal relationships with clients. No emotional attachments. No exceptions. These weren't just guidelines. They were survival tactics in a world where billionaires and power brokers played games with human lives as easily as they moved money across international markets. Her phone buzzed with the familiar tone that signaled a new assignment. Helena Blackwood's name appeared on the screen, the iron-willed director of Meridian, who'd plucked Clara from a life of uncertainty and shaped her into one of their most requested companions. The message was brief. As always, Santorini. 1 week, Adrian Black. Departure in 3 hours. Car waiting. Clara's fingers paused over the screen. Adrian Black. Even in their rarefied world of ultra-wealthy clients, his name carried weight. The tech mogul had built an empire from nothing, his innovations reshaping how the world connected and communicated. But it wasn't his billions that made him dangerous. It was his reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of the rules, standing in his way. She'd heard the whispers from other companions who'd worked events where he was present. He never hired their services directly, preferring to maintain his image as a man who needed no artificial companionship. Yet here was his name on her assignment, requesting her specifically for a week-long stay at his private villa during crucial negotiations with European investors. The drive to the private airfield was silent, her usual pre-assignment ritual of mental preparation feeling different this time. As the Mediterranean coastline appeared below the jet's windows, Clara found herself thinking about the USB drive she'd seen Vivian pocket. In the 3 days since witnessing her mentor's betrayal, she'd barely slept, the weight of the secret pressing against her chest like a physical thing. Vivian had been her guide, teaching her how to navigate the treacherous waters of their profession. Never let them see the real you, she'd said during Clara's first week. The moment you become human to them, you become vulnerable, and vulnerable companions don't survive long in this business. Yet their Vivian had been stealing information that could topple governments, her hands shaking with the same fear Clara felt every day, the fear of what would happen if they ever stepped out of line, if they ever forgot their place in the carefully constructed hierarchy of power and submission. The villa materialized like something from a dream, white stone and glass rising from the clifftop like a modern temple to wealth. As Clara's car wound up the serpentine driveway, she caught glimpses of infinity pools that seemed to spill into the azure sea beyond, manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people earned in a lifetime, and terraces that offered views of paradise itself. She'd been in luxury before. Meridian's clients didn't settle for anything less than extraordinary, but this felt different, more intimate, more dangerous. The staff who met her at the entrance moved with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to serving the impossibly rich. Her luggage disappeared without fanfare, and she was escorted through rooms that showcased art pieces, She recognized from museum catalogs each casual decoration, worth more than her apartment back in New York. "Mr. Black is finishing a call," the house manager informed her. His British accent refined enough to suggest he was probably worth a small fortune himself. "He'll join you for dinner at 8. Your quarters are prepared, and anything you need can be arranged with a phone call." Alone in her suite, which was larger than most hotel presidential suites, Clara unpacked methodically, hanging each carefully selected outfit in the walk-in closet. Through the bedroom's glass walls, the Aegean Sea stretched endlessly, its surface catching the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. She'd done this dance dozens of times before. Rive, assess, adapt, become whatever version of herself the client needed while never letting them glimpse the woman beneath the performance. But standing in that beautiful prison, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. Adrian Black hadn't requested her for her conversation skills or her ability to navigate social situations. Men like him had staff for that. He'd requested her because she was known as the untouchable, the one companion who'd never broken the rules, never compromised her position. The question that haunted her as she prepared for their first meeting was simple. What did a man who could have anything want with a woman he couldn't touch? Clara woke to the sound of rain against her bedroom windows, the Mediterranean storm having rolled in during the night like an omen. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of the previous evening's conversation, every inflection in Adrian's voice when he'd admitted to wanting something he couldn't control. The smart thing would be to request immediate reassignment, to claim illness or family emergency, anything to escape, before she did something irreversibly stupid. Instead, she found herself selecting a soft gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans, clothes more casual than anything she'd packed for the assignment. The reflection in her mirror looked different somehow, less armored, more vulnerable. It terrified her. The villa felt different in the storm, intimate and cocooned rather than grandly imposing. Clara made her way to the library, seeking refuge in the familiar comfort of books, but found Adrian already there, standing before floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dramatic view of the churning sea. He wore a simple black sweater and dark pants, his usual business attire replaced by something more human. When he turned at her entrance, his expression was unguarded in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying none of yesterday's careful control. "Sleep well?" The lie came automatically. "Yes, thank you." His smile was knowing but not unkind. "I didn't either. Would you like coffee?" "I make better coffee than my staff," though admitting that probably violates some billionaire code of conduct. The kitchen was a temple to culinary perfection, all marble surfaces and professional-grade equipment. But watching Adrian move through the space with easy familiarity, measuring coffee grounds and adjusting the espresso machine's settings, Clara saw glimpses of the man he might have been before wealth and power transformed him into an untouchable figure. "You seem surprised," he observed, handing her a perfect cappuccino in a cup that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "I suppose I expected you to have people for everything." "I do, but some things are better done yourself." He leaned against the counter, his own cup cradled in his hands. "Tell me about your coffee preferences in real life. Not what you think. I want to hear what you actually like." It was such a simple question, but it hit Clara like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had asked about her preferences without calculating how the answer could serve their purposes? "Gas station coffee," she admitted before she could stop herself. "The really terrible kind that's been sitting on the burner for hours. I know it's awful, but it reminds me of—" She caught herself, the walls slamming back into place. "Of what?" "It's not important." Adrian set down his cup and moved closer. Not close enough to invade her personal space, but near enough that she could see the genuine curiosity in his eyes. "Everything about you is important, Clara. When are you going to believe that? When it stops being dangerous to believe it?" They spent the morning in the library, ostensibly so Clara could be available if Adrian needed anything for his business calls, but instead of working, he showed her first editions that belonged in museums, shared stories about acquisitions that revealed more about his character than any business profile ever could. He didn't just collect art and books, he understood them, valued them for more than their monetary worth. "This Neruda edition," he said, pulling a slim volume from the shelf, "was owned by a woman who fled Chile during Pinochet's regime. She sold it to feed her family after reaching America, but not before inscribing a message inside the cover." Clara accepted the book with reverent hands, opening to find elegant Spanish script on the inside cover. "Para mi hija, el amor es más fuerte. Que el miedo. Love is stronger than fear." "She was right," Adrian said softly, watching Clara's face as she read. "Fear makes us small, keeps us trapped in cages we could open if we just found the courage." Clara closed the book carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Some cages exist for good reasons. Some fears keep us safe, and some fears keep us from living. The afternoon brought a break in the storm, and Adrian suggested a walk through the villa's gardens. The grounds were extensive, featuring hidden courtyards, cascading fountains, and terraces that offered breathtaking views of the clearing sky. But it was the rose garden that undid Clara's remaining composure. Hundreds of roses in every conceivable color created a living tapestry of beauty and fragrance. Adrian led her along winding paths between the beds, his knowledge of different varieties suggesting this wasn't just landscape decoration, but a genuine passion. "These are David Austin roses," he explained, stopping beside a bush heavy with cream-colored blooms that seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight. "They're called Claire Austin, perfect white roses with the most incredible fragrance." Without thinking, Clara leaned forward to inhale the scent, her eyes closing in pleasure. When she opened them, she found Adrian watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "You love roses," he said, not a question but a statement of observed truth. "My grandmother had a small garden behind her house in Tucson. Nothing like this. Just a few bushes she nursed through desert summers with recycled dishwater and determination. But when they bloomed..." Clara's voice trailed off as she realized how much she'd revealed. "Tell me about her, Adrian. This isn't what you're paying for." His expression darkened. Stop reducing yourself to a transaction. "I'm not asking because I'm paying you, I'm asking because I want to know who Clara Martinez really is underneath all the protective layers you've built." Something in his tone, a rawness that matched her own carefully hidden vulnerability, made the walls crack a little wider. "She raised me after my parents died, taught me that beauty was worth fighting for, even when everything else was falling apart." The roses were her rebellion against the ugliness of poverty and loss. "What happened to her?" "Cancer. I was 17. Clara's voice was steady, but Adrian must have seen something in her expression because he stepped closer, his hand almost reaching for hers before stopping. "I'm sorry. She made me promise to find beauty wherever I could, to never settle for less than I deserved. I think she'd be disappointed in how I've interpreted that promise. Maybe she'd understand that sometimes we have to survive first, before we can figure out how to live." The observation hit too close to home, and Clara felt tears threaten for the first time in years. She turned away, focusing on the roses to regain her composure. But Adrian's voice stopped her retreat. "My mother loved gardens too. She died when I was 12, car accident. My father buried himself in work afterward. Taught me that emotional attachments were weaknesses that could be exploited. It took me years to understand that he wasn't protecting me from grief. He was teaching me to be afraid of it." Clara turned back, seeing something in Adrian's face she recognized, the careful blankness of someone who'd learned to hide their pain so thoroughly it became second nature. "Is that why you built all this?" she asked, gesturing toward the magnificent gardens surrounding them. "For her. For the boy who used to believe in beauty before he learned that wanting things made you vulnerable." His smile was self-deprecating. "Turns out you can buy paradise, but you can't enjoy it if you're too afraid to let anyone share it with you." They were standing too close, the space between them charged with recognition and something far more dangerous. Clara could see the exact moment when Adrian made his decision, when he stopped fighting whatever was building between them and accepted its inevitability. "Clara," he said, her name a question and a promise. "We can't." But even as she said it, she didn't step away. "Can't what?" "Feel something real? Want something beyond the roles we've been assigned?" His hand rose slowly, giving her time to retreat. before his fingers touched her cheek with devastating gentleness. "I've spent 15 years building walls, convinced that isolation was strength. But looking at you, seeing the way you've turned survival into art, I'm starting to think we've both been prisoners in cages of our own making." Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite every instinct screaming at her to run. For just a moment, she let herself imagine what it would feel like to be wanted not as an accessory or a service, but as herself, messy and complicated and beautifully human. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "The most worthwhile things usually are." When she opened her eyes, his face was so close she could count the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could see the barely restrained emotion he was trying so hard to control. "Adrian, I know," he said softly. "I know all the reasons why this is impossible. But right now, standing here with you, I can't bring myself to care about any of them." The rain began again, fat drops that sent them hurrying toward the villa's shelter. But as they ran laughing through the gardens, Clara's hand clasped firmly in Adrian's. She felt something she'd thought was lost forever, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she deserved more than the beautiful cage she'd built around her heart. At exactly 8 o'clock, Clara descended the villa's sweeping staircase, her emerald silk dress whispering against her legs with each calculated step. She'd chosen the color deliberately. It complemented her dark hair and olive skin while maintaining the professional distance her reputation required. Every detail was perfect, from her understated jewelry to the way her hair fell in loose waves over one shoulder. Adrian Black stood on the terrace with his back to her, silhouetted against the dying light of the Mediterranean sunset. Even from behind, he commanded attention, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that showed just enough gray at the temples to suggest experience rather than age. When he turned to face her, Clara felt something unexpected, a moment of genuine surprise. The photographs in business magazines hadn't captured the intensity of his presence, the way his dark eyes seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance. Without feeling invasive, there was something almost predatory about his stillness, like a hunter who'd learned patience was more effective than aggression. "Clara." Her name sounded different in his voice, less like a business transaction, and more like something personal. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Black." She extended her hand in the practiced gesture that had become second nature. Brief contact, professional smile, immediate withdrawal. But he held her fingers a moment longer than necessary, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a touch so subtle she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. "Adrian, please, we'll be spending the week together." He released her hand and gestured toward the table set for two on the terrace's edge. "I thought we'd start with dinner and conversation. I understand you're exceptional at both." The meal was a masterpiece of culinary art, each course perfectly paired with wines that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But Clara found herself struggling to maintain her usual professional poise. Adrian Black didn't treat her like an accessory or a decoration. He asked about her opinions on everything, from the political situation in Eastern Europe to her thoughts on modern art, listening to her responses with an attention that felt uncomfortably real. "You're not what I expected," he said during the third course, his eyes never leaving her face. "And what did you expect?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, a crack in her carefully maintained facade. "Someone more." He paused, considering his words. "Mechanical. The reports I received described you as perfectly professional, completely detached, the untouchable." His lips curved in what might have been amusement. "But there's something in your eyes that suggests otherwise." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks and forced herself to look out at the darkening sea. "I'm exactly what you requested, Mr. Black. A professional companion for your business week. Nothing more, nothing less, Adrian," he corrected softly. "And I think you're considerably more than that." The conversation continued through coffee and cognac, but something fundamental had shifted. Adrian didn't make obvious moves or inappropriate suggestions. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He treated her like a woman whose thoughts and feelings mattered, whose presence was valued for more than her ability to smile and nod at appropriate moments. When he walked her to her suite, Clara expected the usual awkward moment where clients tested boundaries, where she'd have to politely but firmly remind them of the rules. Instead, Adrian stopped at her door and studied her face in the soft hallway lighting. "I have meetings tomorrow until late afternoon," he said. "But I'd like to show you something afterward, if you're interested. The villa has a private beach. That's quite beautiful at sunset. Of course, whatever you require." Something flickered across his expression: disappointment. "Perhaps it's not a requirement, Clara. It's an invitation. There's a difference." After he left, Clara stood in her darkened suite, her heart beating too fast, her skin still tingling from that barely there touch during their introduction. She'd handled dozens of powerful men, navigated countless attempts at seduction and manipulation. But Adrian Black was playing a different game entirely. He wasn't trying to break the rules, he was acting as if they didn't exist. The next day passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Clara explored the villa's grounds, swam in the infinity pool, and tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened every time she glimpsed Adrian through his office windows during his video conferences. She'd been trained to read people, to anticipate their needs and desires, but Adrian remained frustratingly opaque, his intentions as mysterious as the expression in his dark eyes. When he found her on the private beach as promised, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara had armored herself in a white sundress that was both beautiful and utterly professional. "Tell me about your life before Meridian," he said as they walked along the water's edge, their feet leaving temporary impressions in the wet sand. "That's not really relevant to your needs, Mr. Adrian. Everything about you is relevant." He stopped walking and turned to face her, the intensity of his gaze making her feel exposed despite being fully clothed. "You're not just a service I've hired, Clara. You're a woman with thoughts, dreams, fears, desires. Pretending otherwise is an insult to both of us. You don't understand." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "Those thoughts and dreams you're talking about, they're luxuries I can't afford. The rules exist for a reason." "Whose rules?" His voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "Who decided that? You have to live behind glass walls, looking but never touching, wanting but never having." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, the evening breeze suddenly feeling cold against her skin. "People like you decided. People with power and money and the ability to destroy lives with a phone call. The rules protect me from becoming just another casualty in games I don't understand." "And what if I told you I'm not interested in playing games?" She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "That I'd say you're either naive or lying. Men in your position don't deal with companies like Meridian unless they want something they can control completely." Adrian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that his presence seemed to envelop her like warmth from a fire. "You're right about one thing," he said softly. "I do want something I can't control. I want to know what Clara Martinez dreams about when she's not being the untouchable. I want to understand what makes you smile when you think no one is watching. I want to discover if the woman I glimpse behind all that careful perfection is half as remarkable as I suspect she is." Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that led to broken rules and shattered careers. But as she looked up into Adrian's face, seeing something that looked remarkably like genuine emotion rather than calculated manipulation, she felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. "You can't want that," she whispered. "Too late," he replied, his voice rough with something that sounded like honesty. "I already do." The next 2 days passed in a haze of stolen moments and careful restraint. Adrian didn't push, didn't demand more than Clara felt safe giving, but his presence had become a constant gravitational pull threatening to destroy the careful orbit of her professional boundaries. He found excuses to seek her out, asking her opinion on art purchases that were clearly pretexts, inviting her to join him for meals that stretched into hours of conversation, sharing stories from his past that revealed depths she hadn't expected. But it was the small gestures that truly undid her, the way he remembered. She preferred her coffee slightly cooler, how he'd casually moved a first edition of Garcia Marquez to her nightstand, without comment, the protective way he positioned himself between her and his business associates during their brief appearance at a cocktail reception on the yacht of a neighboring oligarch. Clara felt herself fragmenting, split between the woman she'd been trained to be and someone she'd forgotten existed, someone capable of wanting things beyond safety and control. The breaking point came on Thursday evening. Clara was in her suite, attempting to file her nightly report to Helena Blackwood's sanitized updates that mentioned nothing about the growing tension between her and Adrian, when she heard raised voices from the terrace below. Moving to her balcony, she could see Adrian pacing as he spoke rapidly into his phone, his body language radiating frustration and anger. "I don't care what the shareholders think," he was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "The Cambodia project gets shut down permanently. I won't build my profit margins on child labor, regardless of how many layers of contractors we put between ourselves and the truth." Clara froze. The Cambodia project had been mentioned in several of his business calls throughout the week, a manufacturing deal worth hundreds of millions that would cement his company's expansion into Southeast Asia. For him to walk away from it based on moral concerns would cost him a fortune and likely damage his relationships with key investors. "Find another way," Adrian continued, "or find another job. But this conversation is over." He ended the call and stood gripping the terrace railing, his shoulders rigid with tension. Without thinking, Clara found herself moving toward the door, some instinct driving her to offer comfort despite every rule that should have kept her in her room. She found him still on the terrace, staring out at the moonlit sea with an expression that reminded her of wounded pride trying to disguise itself as indifference. "Difficult call?" she asked softly. Adrian turned, his face cycling through surprise, resignation, and something that looked dangerously like relief at her presence. "You heard that? Some of it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop." "Don't apologize. It's your job to be aware of my business concerns." His tone was deliberately neutral, but Clara could see the exhaustion beneath it. "Is it?" she challenged. "Because it seems to me that your business concerns are none of my business unless you choose to share them." A smile ghosted across his lips. "When did you become so perceptive about the distinction?" "When you started treating me like my opinions mattered." They stood in comfortable silence for several moments, the night air warm enough to carry the scent of jasmine from the gardens below. Clara knew she should return to her room, maintain the professional distance that had kept her safe for 3 years. Instead, she found herself moving closer to the railing, close enough to see the tension in Adrian's profile. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "That my board will think I've lost my mind. The investors in tomorrow's meeting will probably walk away, and you'd rather have their money than their respect." Adrian looked at her sharply, something shifting in his expression. "Most people would say money and respect are the same thing in my world. Most people aren't being asked to sleep at night, knowing children are paying the price for their profit margins. Is that what you think of me? That I'm capable of sleeping peacefully regardless of the cost?" The question hung between them, loaded with meanings Clara wasn't sure she was ready to explore. In the moonlight, stripped of his usual commanding presence, Adrian looked younger, more vulnerable, like someone who'd spent so long making impossible choices that he'd forgotten there might be another way. "I think," Clara said carefully, "that you're a man who's spent so long believing he has to choose between success and conscience, that you've forgotten they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And what would you know about that choice?" The question wasn't cruel, but it was direct enough to sting, more than you might think. Clara felt something shift inside her, a reckless momentum that carried her past caution. "Do you want to know why I really joined Meridian? Why someone with a master's degree in art history ended up as a professional ornament for rich men's egos?" Adrian's attention sharpened, his full focus settling on her like a physical weight. "My grandmother left me her house when she died. It wasn't much, small, old, in a neighborhood that was falling apart, but it was mine. The only thing I'd ever owned that nobody could take away." Clara's voice caught slightly, but she pushed forward. "I was working at a museum in Phoenix, barely making rent, but I was happy. I loved the work, loved being surrounded by beauty and history." "What happened?" "My supervisor, Dr. Richard Morse, department head, married, pillar of the community, decided I was the perfect candidate for after-hours private consultations. When I refused, he made sure my research was plagiarized, my recommendations ignored, my contract terminated." Clara's hands clenched on the railing. He destroyed my reputation so thoroughly that no museum in the country would hire me. I lost my job, couldn't make the mortgage payments, and watched the only home I'd ever known get sold at auction. Adrian's face had gone very still, his eyes dark with something that looked like controlled rage. I could have fought him, could have taken legal action, but he had resources, connections, a team of lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. I had student loans and a checking account with 3 digits. Clara's laugh was bitter. So I made a choice. I could be a victim, or I could learn how to survive in a world where power is the only currency that matters. Clara. Adrian's voice was rough with emotion. Helena Blackwood recruited me 6 months after I lost everything. She offered me a way to reclaim some control, to turn my appearance and education into assets instead of liabilities. The rules weren't restrictions, they were protection. They kept me from ever being vulnerable to another Richard Morse. And now, Clara met his gaze, seeing her own conflict reflected in his dark eyes. Now I'm standing on a terrace with a man who's walking away from millions of dollars because it's the right thing to do, and I'm remembering what it felt like to believe that conscience could be more valuable than safety. Adrian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, close enough that his presence seemed to surround her with warmth and possibility. What if I told you that this week has made me question everything I thought I knew about what I wanted from life? I'd say you're not the only one. His hand rose slowly, fingers tracing the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. What if I told you that I've spent the last 4 days trying to convince myself that what I'm feeling is just proximity and convenience, and failing completely? Clara's breath caught. I'd say that makes 2 of us. Clara, he whispered, her name a question and a plea. She could feel her carefully constructed walls crumbling, years of protective instincts dissolving under the weight of his touch, and the genuine emotion in his voice. Every rational thought screamed at her to stop, to step back, to remember all the reasons this was impossible. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the reality of connection they'd been denying. But when Adrian's arms came around her, when he deepened the kiss with a hunger that matched her own, Clara felt something fundamental shift inside her. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't the untouchable. She wasn't a professional service or a beautiful accessory. She was simply Clara, a woman capable of wanting and being wanted in return. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he said softly. "I know. Are you afraid?" Clara considered the question honestly, taking inventory of the terror and exhilaration warring in her chest. "Terrified," she admitted, "but not of you." "Of what then?" "Of wanting something I might not be able to keep." Adrian's hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized. "We're falling. Then maybe," he said, his voice gentle but determined. "It's time we both learned the difference between being afraid and being careful. Time we figured out what we're actually fighting for instead of what we're running from." As Clara looked up into his face, seeing her own hope and fear reflected in his expression, she realized that she'd already made her choice. The rules that had governed her life for 3 years were already broken, shattered the moment she'd let herself see Adrian Black as more than just another client. Now the only question was whether she had the courage to live with the consequences. Clara woke alone in her suite, the memory of Adrian's kiss still burning on her lips, and the taste of possibility heavy in the morning air. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls, transforming her room into a greenhouse of golden light, but she felt exposed rather than warmed. Every mirror seemed to reflect a stranger, a woman whose carefully maintained composure had been replaced by something rawer, more dangerous. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from Helena Blackwood. The final meeting with the European investors was scheduled for that afternoon. Clara's assignment would officially end at sunset, when a car would arrive to take her back to the airfield, back to New York, back to her precisely controlled existence. 12 hours to decide whether the woman who had kissed Adrian Black in the moonlight could survive in the harsh light of reality. She found Adrian in his study, surrounded by financial reports and legal documents, but his attention was focused entirely on his laptop screen. The set of his shoulders told her everything she needed to know about how the morning's calls had gone. How bad? She asked softly. He looked up, his expression shifting from professional concentration to something more complex as he took in her appearance. She'd chosen a cream-colored silk dress that walked the line between elegant and provocative. Armor for whatever battle lay ahead. 3 major investors have withdrawn. My board is calling an emergency meeting for Monday to discuss my leadership capabilities. And Helena Blackwood has been trying to reach you all morning. Clara's stomach clenched. She knows. About last night, probably. Women like Helena Blackwood don't stay in business by ignoring the obvious. Adrian closed the laptop and stood, moving toward her with the same careful intensity that had been building all week. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Don't pretend last night didn't happen, Clara. Don't pretend it didn't change everything. Before she could respond, her phone rang. Helena's name flashed on the screen like a death sentence. Answer it, Adrian said. She needs to hear your voice. Needs to believe you're still in control. Clara's finger hovered over the screen, her training warring with the memory of Adrian's hands in her hair, his whispered confession that she'd made him question everything. The phone continued to ring, each tone like a countdown to the moment when she'd have to choose between safety and possibility. She answered. Clara, darling. Helena's voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. I trust you're well. You've been so difficult to reach. I'm fine, Helena. Just focused on the assignment. Of course you are. And how is Mr. Black? Satisfied with our services? Clara met Adrian's eyes, seeing her own resolve reflected back at her. Completely satisfied. Wonderful. Though I confess, I've heard some interesting rumors from other guests in the area. Something about romantic walks in rose gardens, intimate dinners, extended private conversations. You know how people talk. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Black appreciates intellectual conversation. I've been providing exactly what was requested. I'm sure you have. Nevertheless, I think it would be prudent for you to return to New York this evening as scheduled. We have other clients waiting, and prolonged exposure to any particular environment can be compromising. Of course, good. Your car will arrive at 6. Don't keep them waiting. The line went dead, leaving Clara staring at her phone as if it were a venomous snake. What did she say? Adrian asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. That I need to remember my place. That prolonged exposure to any environment can be compromising. Clara set the phone down with deliberate care. She knows, Adrian. Maybe not the details, but she knows something has changed. And Clara looked at him. This man who had walked away from millions because it was the right thing to do, who had shared his vulnerabilities and seen hers without flinching. And I have 6 hours to decide whether I'm brave enough to find out what happens when I stop being afraid. The afternoon investors' meeting was a masterclass in controlled chaos. Clara watched from the villa's upper terrace as sleek cars deposited men in expensive suits, their faces bearing the particular blend of arrogance and anxiety that came with having more money than several small countries. Adrian had invited her to observe, a gesture that would have been unthinkable from any other client. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see him commanding the room with quiet authority, even as she knew he was hemorrhaging support with every principled stand he took. When Heinrich Müller, a German industrialist worth approximately $8 billion, stormed out, after Adrian refused to reconsider the Cambodia project, Clara felt something shift in her chest. She was watching a man choose integrity over profit, watching him sacrifice everything he'd built rather than compromise his newly discovered conscience. How could she do less? At 4:30, her phone buzzed with a text from Helena. Car arrives at 6. Be ready. At 5 o'clock, Adrian found her on her balcony, where she'd been staring at the sea and trying to imagine a future that didn't exist in carefully regulated increments. It's over, he said simply. 7 investors walked away. My board will vote me out by the end of the week. I'm sorry, don't be. He moved to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. For the first time in 15 years, I made decisions based on what I could live with instead of what would make me the most money. It's terrifying and liberating in equal measure. What will you do now? Start over. Build something smaller but cleaner. Maybe remember that the point of having power is knowing when not to use it. He turned to face her fully. The question is, what will you do? Clara's car would arrive in 55 minutes. In 55 minutes, she could climb into the back seat and return to her carefully constructed life, where beauty was currency and safety was purchased through emotional distance. Or, Helena will destroy me if I stay, she said quietly. She has files on every client I've ever worked with, every moment of vulnerability I've ever shown. If I break my contract, she'll make sure I can never work anywhere, never disappear into a normal life. And if you go back, Clara considered the question honestly. I'll survive. I'll be safe and financially secure and completely hollow. Adrian's hand found hers on the railing, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like both question and answer. There's a third option, he said softly, which is, we face whatever comes next together. I may be losing everything I thought mattered, but I've found something I never knew I needed. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. Stay, Clara. Not because I'm paying you. Not because it's your job, but because this week has shown us both what it feels like to be chosen rather than purchased. Clara's breath caught. In the distance, she could hear the sound of cars departing. The last of Adrian's former associates, abandoning what they saw as a sinking ship. Soon it would be just the two of them in this beautiful prison. To people who had learned that walls meant to keep the world out could also keep love from flourishing. If I stay, Helena will come after us both. She won't just destroy me, she'll go after you. Your business, your reputation. She has resources and connections that make your former board look like amateur hour. Let her come. Adrian's voice was steel wrapped in silk. I've spent my entire adult life being afraid of what I might lose if I fought for what I actually wanted. But you know what I learned this week? The things worth having are the things worth fighting for. At 5:45, Clara made her choice. She walked to her suite, pulled out her phone, and dialed Helena's number. Clara, darling, I trust you're packed and ready. I'm ready, Helena, but not for what you think. The silence stretched long enough that Clara wondered if the connection had been lost. I beg your pardon. I'm resigning from Meridian, effective immediately. I'll be in breach of contract, which means you'll come after me with everything you have. But I'm not running anymore. You foolish girl. Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? The security, the lifestyle, the protection I've provided. I'm throwing away a cage, Helena, even if it was a beautiful one. And for what? A man who just lost half his fortune because he couldn't control his bleeding heart. Adrian Black will tire of you the moment reality sets in. And when he does, you'll have nothing. No career, no reputation, no future. Clara looked out at the terrace where Adrian waited, his face turned toward her balcony as if he could feel her presence. Maybe, but I'd rather risk everything for something real than settle for a lifetime of beautiful emptiness. This conversation is over, Clara, but our business is just beginning. The line went dead. Clara walked onto the terrace to find Adrian standing exactly where she'd left him, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes dark with hope and fear. Well, he asked. I just made the most terrifying and liberating decision of my life, she said, moving into his arms as naturally as breathing. I chose you. I chose us. I chose the possibility that maybe we can build something better than what we're leaving behind. Adrian's arms came around her, holding her close enough that she could feel his heart beating against her chest. Are you sure? He whispered against her hair, because once we take this step, there's no going back to the way things were. I'm sure, Clara said, and for the first time in years, she meant it completely. I'm tired of being untouchable. I want to be touched, chosen, cherished. I want to be yours, and I want you to be mine. When he kissed her, it tasted like freedom. 6 months later, Clara stood in the garden of a much smaller villa on the Italian coast, her hands covered in soil as she tended to the rose bushes she and Adrian had planted together. The morning sun filtered through olive trees, casting dappled shadows on the stone pathways they'd designed themselves. The past 6 months had been everything Helena had promised: difficult, uncertain, sometimes Terrifying. True to her word, the Meridian director had made their lives complicated, using her connections to freeze assets, spread rumors, and generally make their transition to a life outside her control as challenging as possible. But she'd also been wrong about one crucial thing. Adrian hadn't tired of Clara when reality set in. Instead, he'd become more devoted, more determined to build something worthy of the sacrifice they'd both made. The new company was smaller, focused on sustainable technology rather than pure profit maximization. They had to sell properties, liquidate investments, and start over with a fraction of Adrian's previous resources. But the work felt honest in a way his previous empire never had. Clara heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up to see Adrian approaching with 2 cups of coffee, the terrible gas station variety she'd admitted to loving, which he now specially ordered from New York. "Any word from the lawyers?" she asked, accepting the cup with dirt-stained fingers. Helena's latest lawsuit was dismissed. Turns out, trying to enforce contracts that essentially amount to emotional slavery doesn't play well in court. Adrian's smile was satisfied but not cruel. She's running out of legal options and financial leverage. And the Cambodia investigation? The factory conditions were even worse than we thought. 3 major corporations are facing congressional hearings, and the children who were working there have been relocated to legitimate schools. Adrian's expression grew serious. It would have destroyed me to know I was complicit in that, even indirectly. Clara stood, brushing soil from her hands, and moved into his arms. Even after 6 months, the simple joy of being able to touch him freely, to be touched in return without calculation or professional distance, still felt like a miracle. "Any regrets?" she asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "About walking away from a billion-dollar deal to follow my conscience, about choosing love over safety, about believing that a woman I was supposed to see as a service could actually be my partner in everything that matters." Adrian's eyes crinkled with humor. "Not a single one." "You?" Clara thought about her answer. Taking inventory of their new life, the villa was 1/10 the size of Adrian's previous estate. Their bank account was healthy but not astronomical. She would never again walk into a room knowing she was the most expensively dressed person there. Never again have the security of knowing exactly what was expected of her. But she woke up every morning in Adrian's arms. She spent her days working alongside him, their partnership extending far beyond the bedroom into every aspect of building their new company. She was using her art history background to help design sustainable manufacturing spaces that were as beautiful as they were functional. And for the first time since her grandmother's death, she was tending roses that belonged to her. "Not a single one," she said, meaning it completely, that evening, as they sat on their small terrace watching the sun set over the Mediterranean. Clara's phone buzzed with an unexpected message. The sender was a name she hadn't seen in months. "Vivian Sterling. I saw the news about your new company," the message read. "Also saw that Helena's lawsuits keep getting dismissed. I have information that might help ensure they stay that way. Can we meet?" Clara showed the message to Adrian, who raised an eyebrow. "Your former mentor wants to help us fight Helena Blackwood? Apparently, though I'm not sure I trust her motives. What's your instinct?" Clara thought about the last time she'd seen Vivian, trembling hands slipping a USB drive into her purse, the weight of secrets and betrayals that seemed to follow everyone who'd ever worked for Meridian. That she's finally ready to stop being afraid of the consequences of doing the right thing. 2 weeks later, Vivian arrived at their villa looking older but more peaceful than Clara remembered. Over dinner on the terrace, she explained what had driven her to steal those files. Helena had been blackmailing clients for years, using information gathered during assignments to manipulate business deals, political decisions, even family relationships. The USB contained evidence of everything: illegal surveillance, extortion, human trafficking connections. I'd been collecting it for months, trying to find the courage to act. "Why now?" Adrian asked. Vivian's smile was sad but genuine. "Because watching you to choose each other over everything else Helena could threaten you with reminded me that some things are worth the risk. I've spent 15 years being complicit in a system that treats women like commodities and men like marks. I can't change the past, but I can help ensure the future is different." The information Vivian provided was everything they needed to not only end Helena's harassment, but to expose the full scope of Meridian's operations. Within 3 months, the agency was shut down, its assets frozen, and Helena Blackwood was facing federal charges for racketeering, extortion, and human trafficking. On the day Helena's conviction was announced, Clara was in their garden, training new rose vines to climb the trellises Adrian had built. Her phone buzzed with news alerts, messages from former Meridian companions who were finally free, and congratulations from the team of lawyers who'd helped bring down the empire that had once controlled their lives. But the message that mattered most came from Adrian, who was in Milan on business. Justice is sweet, but coming home to you is sweeter. See you tonight. I love you. Clara smiled, her heart full in a way she'd once thought impossible. She'd learned that being untouchable wasn't strength, it was fear wearing expensive clothes. Real strength was allowing herself to be vulnerable, to be chosen, to be loved completely and without conditions. As the sun set over their new life, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Clara reflected on how far they'd both traveled from the people they'd been 6 months ago. Adrian had learned that true power came from choosing principle over profit. She'd learned that real security came from being valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. Neither path had been easy, but standing in their garden, surrounded by roses that bloomed because they'd chosen to tend them together, Clara knew they'd made the right choice. Love, it turned out, was indeed stronger than fear. Clara and Adrian's story raises important questions about power, choice, and the courage required to break free from systems that seem to offer security, while actually providing only the illusion of control. Their journey from professional distance to genuine partnership illustrates that sometimes the greatest risk is not in reaching for what we want, but in settling for what we think we deserve. In a world where financial security and emotional safety often seem mutually exclusive, where do you draw the line between practical compromise and betraying your authentic self? Clara chose love over security. Adrian chose principle over profit, but their circumstances were extreme. In your own life, when have you had to choose between what felt safe and what felt true? And looking at their story, do you believe they made the right choice? Or do you think there might have been a way to have both security and authenticity without such dramatic sacrifice? What would you have done in Clara's position, in Adrian's? And what does their story suggest about the real cost of the cages we build around our hearts?